welcome to TC Media's second Saturday. We'll be discussing information versus misinformation and fake news. My name is Jessica Heist, and I'm the Development Director here at TC Media.
And I'm Mary Beth Harrington. I'm a columnist for the Jolt News. So every week, I'm sure most of you have heard the constant barrage of discussion as to whether the media, and this is actually from the media itself, whether or not the information that they provide is true or false.
And chances are, no matter where you're getting your news, you'll be getting misinformation and credible information.
However, in our program today, we are not going to tell you where you should be getting your news or what media is actually factual or accurate.
And like good journalists, we'll be providing you both sides of this story so you can decide what to do with it. And as I said before, my name is Jessica Heist. I have a degree in journalism, and I've worked in newspapers for over 10 years, including the Sacramento Bee and the Indianapolis Star, as well as USA Today. I've also been a chapter president of Sacramento, California's chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and now I'm here with TC Media as Development Director.
And I too have a degree in journalism. I've been working with journalists for about 40 years or so, in some capacity, either doing public relations or being a reporter. I have been a reporter. I have been interviewing people, and currently I am a columnist for the Jolt News.
So today we'll sort of be weaving in our experience as journalists as well as what we've learned in school, and we'll be going over just a brief history of the media and how that's changed over the years, moving into the electronic and social media era, as well as how media ownership affects that. We'll be discussing ethics and how you as consumers can decipher the news that you're digesting.
Some of the content for the program today we gleaned from this book, Killer Underwear Invasion: How to Spot Fake News, Disinformation, and Conspiracy Theories by Elise Gravel. In the book, she actually defines news and fake news very technically. News, for instance, is information about important stuff happening in the world, and fake news is disinformation. It's disreputable, erroneous, wrong, basically lies.
So as you know, fake news is not new. The first published newspaper and gossip columns were published in 59 BCE, so there's been a lot of opportunities for fake news, and people in power have been abusing the power of the media for centuries.
Some of you may recall a time when Americans trusted the news media. Walter Cronkite was known as the most trusted man in America. In fact, after he went over to Vietnam and then did a commentary about how the war was going, and it was labeled an opinion piece, he actually talked about how he didn't think Americans should be continuing in the war. And with that, the president at the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson, saw this and said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost middle America."
Both Mary Beth and I have studied ethics when we were studying journalism in school, and the ethics in the United States are set forth by the Society of Professional Journalists, and every so often they'll update them based on what's happening in the news. So some examples of the ethics are, first and foremost, is seek truth and report it. Be accountable and transparent. So that's providing both sides to a story. If you're talking about something that's controversial, you'll naturally use multiple sources on both sides to let the readers kind of figure out how they want to make of it. Another really important one is minimizing harm. No matter what story you're putting out, you want to make sure that no one is going to be harmed or feel terrible about what you're writing. And one of my mentors told me something that I'll never forget, which is you're a person first and a journalist second. So you always keep that in mind. And then act independently. So an example of that is journalists don't usually vote because voting records are open to the public. So you want to remain as unbiased as possible. You also don't want to take money for a story, although some do. But in general, good news doesn't sway.
So when Jessica and I were in journalism school, the very first thing they taught us is who, what, when, where, and why are the pinnacle questions that you ask when conducting an interview, and most of you probably already know that. But it was a good reminder to journalists as to how they need to perform their duties. When I worked with the Dallas Morning News, this is a picture of the Dallas Morning News building. When you walk into the building, you go up some steps, and on the building is this phrase: "Build the news upon the rock of truth and righteousness. Conduct it always upon the lines of fairness and integrity. Acknowledge the right of the people to get from the newspaper both sides of every important question." It was a great reminder every single day of why you were there and what your responsibilities were as a journalist. Other newspapers do the same thing. The Washington Post has a phrase on all of their newspapers: "Democracy dies in darkness." And the New York Times says, "All the news that's fit to print."
So if you grew up in the 60s, most households had one TV, and these were the major networks that you would be watching in black and white.
Then color arrived. And actually, in the 1980s, CNN came about, and CNN actually was the first 24-hour news station. And that really changed things because they weren't just talking about breaking news. The other channels would come in whenever there was a breaking news story. They would interrupt your television program to tell you the breaking news, and then they would go away. But CNN was on 24/7. So what happened was, not only did they have to report the news, they had to find news that needed to be discussed. Following with that, you have the sports with ESPN, and from there, you started to get the evening news programs like MSNBC and Fox News. And again, because they were trying to ensure that they had enough content, the news began to blur between news and opinion or commentary. If you watch MSNBC or Fox News or any of those stations, during the day, most of the time, the content, it tends to be more news-oriented. But if you watch in the evenings, it can veer to more opinion or commentary.
And sometimes it is hard to know when, the so-called authority figures of the news are being truthful. An example of this is Tucker Carlson, who hosts the segment with Fox News. He once alleged that a former Playboy model accepted money from President Trump to keep quiet about an alleged affair. And a federal judge dismissed this lawsuit against Fox News after lawyers for the network argued that no reasonable viewer would take him seriously. So this is a classic example of, entertainment being played out as news for increased ratings.
So most of the time you think, well, it's about ratings, it's about getting more money. Well, the thing that you may not realize is that initially the network news, was not supposed to make a profit. It was never supposed to make money. It was just supposed to be there as a community service. Of course, they still did have ratings, so there was a competitive spirit among the ratings, but again, it was not supposed to be making a profit. And then eventually there came to be some ownership bias, specifically when Rupert Murdoch bought Fox, because then we found where the owners were trying to create more influence on the news and what the news was doing, either to increase the ratings or the advent of having profit. And so then you got into more news versus the commentary, and news actually needing to make a profit.
So prior to 2017, a media owner could only own, one TV station or one radio station to prevent a monopoly. But unfortunately, those rules have changed, and it's in favor of increased competition.
So at this point, you have basically 6 different companies that own some aspect of the electronic news that you watch today. And then for your local news, what we see out of Seattle, you have tend to be 3 major companies that own the local news. Here locally, we have the Olympian, and most of the time, if you check the paper, you'll see that it says that it's owned by the McClatchy Company. And they also own the Miami Herald, the Star in Kansas City, and some other newspapers. But we have done our investigation. We have been intrepid reporters, and we found that the Olympian is actually owned by Chatham Asset Management. So if you really want to know who is pulling the strings for something like the Olympian, you have to go and find out more about Chatham Asset Management. Also, you have an alternative that I have to talk about in the area is the Jolt. The Jolt stands for the Journal of Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater, although it covers all the news in Thurston County. The best thing about the Jolt is that there are no paywalls. It is totally free. You're welcome to subscribe to it. You can just go to thejoltnews.org and subscribe to it. You'll get a daily, weekday summary of the news and the headlines, and then you can also go there to their website for more information on the different stories or calendar of events or things like that. I happen to write a column every Tuesday called The Hidden Sector, which focuses on the nonprofit community. But we also have columnists who talk about birds and talk about gardening and talk about a lot of other subjects that may be of interest to you.
And we're also lucky to have TC Media, and I'm not just saying that because I work here, but I fully believe in our mission. We provide communication resources that build stronger communities, so anyone can come in, to our doors and they can rent anything to create whatever exciting thing they want to create. And I think one of the best things that we do is also we increase government transparency. So we record and stream meetings, we host candidate forums during local elections, we provide voter guides to keep you informed, and anyone, like I said, anyone can come in and get access to resources to share their stories because community is our middle name, so we want to support everyone. So as you have heard, the saying that sticks and stones may break your bones, but words can't hurt you. Unfortunately, that's not the case for the media. And what you say is permanent, and that is especially true for social media.
So I do utilize social media, and actually I think it's very beneficial in a number of different ways. For instance, it gives you access to immediate emergency information. For instance, if there's an accident on I-5, I'll get a notice about it or I'll see a tweet about it and I'll know not to go that way. So it's very helpful in that way. I also find that I utilize it to keep in touch with friends who are all over the world. In fact, I currently have friends who I knew in kindergarten, believe it or not, that we have reconnected through social media. So I think that definitely is a benefit of the social media experience. However, it has its drawbacks as well. There's very little check on the accuracy. People can write literally whatever they want to write. And it also tends to be reactionary. You've seen this too, especially with the program Next Door, which I love and I think is very helpful. But sometimes people just sort of jump on other people's comments and the trolls and different things like that. And there's little to no self-regulation.
So the Washington Post just released an interesting article about the psychology behind having vast amounts of information at your fingertips, which, as Mary Beth said, can be great, but there's also a drawback to that. So when we're learning stuff, we use mental shortcuts to sort of make judgments, which can be great. But unfortunately, the more we see, the more we're likely to believe it to be true.
So one example of this is I happened to be watching the show Harry and Meghan on Netflix. And during the show, this author, David Olusogo, I apologize, sir, if that I butchered your name, had a comment. This is what happens when you have a press that is devoid of journalism, that lives on outrage and monetizes anger. And I think specifically he was talking about what we call the tabloid journalism in Britain. But as you can see, that's starting to permeate here into our area. I remember when the National Enquirer was a joke, that you didn't believe anything that it said. Nowadays, that's not always the case. I also thought that there was a very poignant comment from Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, who said, "Misinformation is a global humanitarian crisis."
And if you've ever seen the documentary that Mary Beth mentioned, or if you were keeping up with the news during this time, Meghan Markle was targeted on social media. And recently, Bot Sentinel, an organization that analyzes information and puts out reports, they analyzed over 114,000 tweets, and they realized that 70% of the content came from just 83 accounts that reached 17 million people. So this, coordinated attack was to gain money, and it was also to promote racism. So it just goes to show you how few people can make an impact.
So is anybody watching social media? Is anybody keeping track of it? Well, unfortunately, and this is probably going to surprise many of you, if, for instance, I were to print something in the paper about Jessica that was inaccurate, then she could sue me, but she could also sue the media, the print media that I printed this in. It's the same thing with electronic. However, if I say something about Jessica that's erroneous in social media, she can also sue me if she can find me with the IP addresses, but she cannot sue Facebook. She cannot sue Twitter. She cannot sue those social media platforms. And that's because of what is known as Section 230. This was by the FCC, and it specifically says that websites, including social media companies, are immune to liability. Now, just so you know, and this is sort of breaking news, there is a court case that's going on in Seattle that's going to be challenging this Section 230. So you have to stay tuned to find out what happens.
So as consumers, it's so easy to just click share, retweet, but there are a few things that you need to just remember when you're sharing information. Even if it was shared by a friend, by a celebrity or a politician, if everyone's talking about it, if it sounds or feels true, or an expert confirms it, you still need to do your extra research.
And going back to our book, our healthy book, they gave us, Elise Gravel gives us actually 10 different things to look for on how what you can use to tell real news from fake news. First of all, think critically. Is this true? Is this real? I mean, can legitimately the moon be made of cheese? Let's think about that for real for a while. And then also check your source. Is it a reputable source? Is it a source that is known to provide erroneous information? Also, can you find that same information from multiple sources or several different media outlets reporting this information? Also, try to figure out, is it fact or is it opinion? A lot of times it will be noted whether it's opinion or commentary, but not all the time, unfortunately. And finally, is this a joke? There's a publication that's called The Onion that I know my husband just loves to read, and everything about it is fabrication. But sometimes it gets a little bit close to the truth, and so it makes you start to wonder. And so that's one of the things to figure out is this an actual joke? 5 other things that you could be checking for are who will gain from this? Who's going to really profit from the information that's provided? Check the quality of the news source. And are they considered a reputable news source? Also, and this is bad for me, do not just read the headlines, because different people, you may not realize this, is that the reporter could be actually writing the story, but somebody else is writing the headlines. And the headlines are just what you think they are. They're meant to be interesting and get your attention. And so a lot of times the headlines are not accurate information. So you really need to read the article not rather than just go by the headlines. Also, keep your emotions in check, especially if you are the one who's promoting some information. And carefully choose whom you trust. Right now I have just 2 or 3 different media sources that I use and that I trust. And so whatever I hear in the news, I go to see what they say before I believe the information that's presented.
So as consumers, there's a few things that you can do. You have a responsibility, and you need more than one perspective, and seek your resources out. And that may seem daunting as you're you've got all these news resources that you have to sift through. But something that I do want to mention is we're really privileged to live in this country where there are, so many things that we can read, so many things that we can learn from. Because a lot of times, if you live in a country that's censored, and there's also people in the media who are actually dying, quite literally, to provide you with news. And this is also a great time for us to be in Thurston County, too, because we have the Jolt and TC Media here to keep you informed in a very unbiased way and provide you with resources.
With that, we have a few audience members here. If they have any questions, we have some microphones available. We can't promise to know all the answers.
Okay. So I'm asking what your advice would be for parents of teens who are immersed in social media and really take it at face value, other than perhaps purchasing the book that you're holding up. What would your advice be?
Well, I would really recommend this book. I mean, it looks a little comical, but it's very, very good. It's good for adults. It's also good for children too. So definitely, I would recommend this publication. But also, I think that what would be helpful is if there were certain things that they bring to your attention that you can refute. And you can prove that that information is false. And so once they start to see that, then hopefully they'll start to realize. Also, this course is something, the slides can be provided to you if you're interested, just for them to learn to not necessarily, and we all fall for it. I mean, how many times have you, it's happened to me, where I have seen something on the news, so-and-so has passed away, right? And then you retweet it. And then everybody comes back at you and says, no, that person's not dead. What are you talking about? So we're all, clickbait. One of the things that I try to do is when I'm on Facebook, there is a news feed and I might go through the news, but I do not click on it. Because what that does is it sends you down that rabbit hole. You probably, you haven't necessarily checked the news source also, and I found that a lot of times there are very disreputable news sources that post on there and provide information. But also the problem is once you've gone down that rabbit hole, then the analytics will say, oh, you want to know more about this. And so then you'll start getting more and more information about that. And again, it'll be, if you went down the first rabbit hole that was with a disreputable news source, then you're going to get more disreputable news. So it sort of, builds on itself.
I'm going to jump in with a question here. I think turned on. So in recent years, the media writ large has been villainized for political purposes. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or comments about how our mainstream media is, what they are doing or what they could do to rebuild trust with the general public.
Well, let me start by one thing, and then I'll allow Jessica to speak. My husband and my son are history teachers, and so they especially like to learn about World War II. And one thing to be very aware of is that one of the very first things that any dictator will do, and this is actually what happened in Germany, is they take over the news media, and they make it, and they do exactly the type of thing that is happening now. Now, what's going on right now may be conscious or it may be unconscious, but it's something to be aware of, is that when you do not have the media as a check on the rest of society and the rest of our government, that really is a chance for democracy to start to go away.
Yeah, and I think also something to keep in mind is make use of your local news sources, because that'll just be a little bit more informational for you. And some of them might not have those sort of clickbait stories. They just want to get down to the news.
One other factor, when you said specifically is what can the news do? It can be ensure that it is reporting accurate information and that the information is balanced. However, and my daughter just actually said this to me last night, somehow the news thinks it has to provide all the news. So even if there is false information out there, sometimes the news will provide that because it wants to show balance, and that's not necessarily needed. I don't think the news should be promoting incorrect information. Even if they say it's incorrect, that information may not get across to the reader or viewer. So if you want to give two truthful sides to a story, I think that's great. But I would not try to give false information just to show that you're trying to be balanced.
I actually believe that most people want pretty much the same thing. And I heard a Mark Twain quote back a while ago about putting ants in a jar, black ants and red ants, and if you leave them alone, the ants will get along. But if you shake the jar, the ants will start trying to hurt each other because they both think the other side did it. I honestly believe that it's not the people that are causing this problem. I think it's more of the news systems and the information systems, once again, trying to monetize what's going on here. And I'm wondering if you're aware of any laws or rules that either have been taken out of our system or put into our system, or people that are moving in that direction to try to hold our information sources more accountable for the information they're giving out.
Well, I know the FCC has eliminated many rules and many things that used to be done to ensure that the news was accurate and truthful. I don't know if there's anything else.
I do know that some newspapers are trying to unionize to sort of put in those protections. Because one of the reasons that I left working in newsrooms was because there was sort of this shift in 2018 where the idea was brought up that if your story had more clicks on it, you'd be paid more. And that paper that I left has actually unionized to protect the journalists. And it has been a huge fight for them, but there are more protections in place.
And it's interesting, we hadn't discussed this story, but I have a similar story that I left reporting when I was working for a very, very small town paper, and I happened to come across a situation where there was some nefarious things being done in City Hall. And I wanted to report about it, but my editor didn't allow me to because it would, ruffle too many feathers or things like that. One thing that if you really, really want to see pure journalism in action, I know it's kind of an older movie, but All the President's Men, I think, is a great movie that really shows you about the lives of journalists. Some people who are younger may say, well, this is really boring. Well, yeah, journalism and reporting can be very boring. It's spending a lot of time on front of the computer or in the library or things like that. But for a more updated version, there's a new television series out by ABC called Alaska Daily. Hilary Swank is in it. It only has gone one season, and the ratings aren't very good right now, so if you see it's available, please watch it. We really want it to stay around. That show is, again, it's obviously sometimes it's a drama, so there is some sensational aspects of it, but it is a very good interpretation of real reporting. And also, it also covers very strongly the issue with missing Indigenous women and what a huge challenge and problem that is. And that, again, is not getting reported in the media very often.
You're right. It does seem like there's a lot of controls on the media. I 100% agree with that. Where was I going? I hate it when the mind goes blank because I'm listening to you guys. I thank you for what you're doing. I think this is a very important topic to be gotten out. But once again, I really believe it's more about the people who are shaking the jar, if you will. And it is, I think you also mentioned the idea of profitable news, people clicking on something. And I do understand that the human being is more drawn to the shock and awe, and they like to click. We're very good at standing over the fence and telling rumors back and forth to each other. And it is something we like. And I also tell people that if you're listening to real news, it is extremely boring. So I understand why we're going down that route, but it is kind of human nature to be pulled to the shock and the awe and the fantastic and I mean, any thoughts on how to help or point or let people know that if you don't like that stuff, don't listen to that stuff?
Well, yes, absolutely. Well, remember in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. If it bleeds, it leads. Yes. Kind of thing. Also, and one thing you said very articulate that reminded me of something. The FCC, Federal Communications Commission. Thank you. I apologize for missing that. They are a government entity, and so they're governed by whoever is in office. And so when you are voting, you're not only voting for a candidate based on, the economics or whatever, it goes down the line. And so the FCC chairman, who's currently in charge, may change depending on who is in government. So it's very interesting that one of the things we don't like about the media is it's influenced by the government, but it's ruled by the government too. So.
Can I just add a comment about the FCC? And Jessica and I had this conversation the other day. The FCC's purpose is to protect public rights of way, public airwaves, to benefit the community at large. But in a recent strategic plan that they released a couple of years ago, the word citizen was not found anywhere, but the word consumer was found frequently. So there's been a real shift in how some of our government agencies see us as citizens of the United States more as, how do you protect the consumer's interest, like, can you regulate cable rates or whatever because it has an impact on the consumer, but not how do you protect the rights of the citizens when it comes to publicly owned things like our airwaves and our public rights of ways. So it was a really interesting shift in their approach. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, as Jessica said in our presentation, one of the fundamental things that the FCC did was when it changed the number of radio stations. Again, to repeat, there was a time back in the 70s, at least I'm aware of, where you as a company could only own one print media, one electronic media, and one radio station in a community, so that therefore you could not monopolize the coverage. And I have done some research, and I have seen communities in the United States, not necessarily in Olympia or Seattle, but communities in the United States where one of these entities owns two television stations or two television stations, a couple radio stations or several radio stations, and even the print media. And so therefore, there's at least 6 sources in your media that are all influencing you, and this company has an agenda, and they're promoting it. And so the stories, one of the interesting things to do is if you know of a national story, if you watch it on, we'll say, ABC News, and you watch the same story on NBC News, and then you watch it on CBS, and then you go to MSNBC, and then you go to Fox, watch the different words they use to explain the story. Watch if the story is even covered by all of those entities, because a lot of times it's not, and watch where the story is placed in the agenda. Several of the media may put it at the front of the story, and others will put it at the end of the story, of the show. So it's really interesting how that can influence, even though they're all covering the same story. So you can say, well, they're all covering the same story, but they're all covering it differently and influencing their viewers or their readers by how they're covering it.
I think you kind of got to one of my points, this is the first time in America that we've actually had people rich enough and corporations rich enough that they can buy and control our information systems. We haven't ever had to deal with this before. We don't have any history in our combined history of understanding this process or seeing this kind of thing happen. And so do you have any thoughts on how to chop it up or divide it or find a way to, I have opinions, lots of them, but I'm not up there.
How can we go back in time? No.
Yeah. I don't even know where to start with
Well,
that one.
I think just having programs like this, and thank you for attending, and talking about it. I think that, so we knew for about a month or so that we were going to do this program. And what I found was interesting is as I watched the news and as I watched just general television programs, I started to hear misinformation and information talked about more and more. And so I think we're getting to the point that people are starting to, like yourself, are starting to notice. It's like, uh-oh, something's going wrong. And the good thing about the United States is that a lot of times when enough people start to see that we're going down a wrong path, we'll reset. And so hopefully if everybody who's in our audience and also viewing this session, that you'll start to talk to each other and say, look, and if somebody says something like, I saw this on social media or I saw this, you can say, look, that's, that was wrong, that's a misinformation. And I think having these discussions will hopefully change the tide.
Anyone else? Comments?
I'm just going to ask just a question. Where do you hope this will go? What change do you see this program and this conversation and this PowerPoint that you went through? I mean, what's your hopes and aspirations for where it's going to end up?
I think we were really excited to do this, I think, as sort of an introduction to fake news, but we're also curious to know what the community wants. We want to meet you where you are. What resources do you want? What do you want to learn? Is really our question.
I think also everybody should start to watch Thurston Community Media more. and subscribe to the Jolt News.
Yeah.
The Jolt News, and I know Thurston Community Media, what makes those two, and I know it's kind of self-serving to say that, but really what makes it unique is because it is from the community. Both are nonprofit organizations. So they're not owned by any large company, and they're not influenced by anything other than the community. So that's really the key. And there are more and more across the country. There are, you hear about print media dying, and unfortunately that's the case. However, what's replacing it in a lot of different communities is nonprofit news and nonprofit media. Now, that's not necessarily the case with electronic media as much, except for NPR. But when you have an entity, especially media, that is nonprofit, then it kind of eliminates some of that profit competitiveness that you had before. And remember, one of the things we said is, there was a time, I remember it, in the 60s or 70s, where the news was not supposed to make a profit. And I think that's why we emphasize that, because a lot of times people don't know that or don't remember that. If you don't have to make a profit, then you're able to really cover the news, and you don't necessarily have to go always for the sensational or different things like that.
Part of this system that's been happening that I've been watching is a lot of the local news, local broadcasters, local channels, local papers, local investigators have all been going away because there's not a lot of money in it.
Yes.
And what I tell people whenever I get a chance is, if you're not investing in some portion of your community that brings the community around the way you want it, nobody else will. I mean, we have to subscribe to newspapers. We have to put a little of ourselves, either through volunteering or giving of our money, to the things that we think will improve our economy. And honestly, if we're not trying to move our system around a little bit, somebody else will do it for us. And so I appreciate what you're doing, and I thank you for being up there.
Thank you. Thanks. And yay for volunteerism. Keep it up. This is a volunteer opportunity. So, there you go.
Well, thank you for joining us.
We hope you learned a lot, And if you have any questions, then feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is available on the screen. And I hope you have a wonderful day.